Hi everyone. If you like our stories, please consider liking and subscribing. We would also greatly appreciate if you tell us in the comments from which country you are listening. Okay, let's begin. Sophie Winters had always been drawn to forgotten things. As a child, she'd dig through her grandmother's attic, unearthing dusty boxes filled with yellowed photographs, rusted lockets, broken music boxes, and brittle postcards from cities no one visited anymore. Now, in her mid-30s, that love hadn't faded. It had matured into something else. Comfort, maybe. A way to anchor herself to a quieter, older time that felt safer than the world she lived in now. After her divorce, Sophie moved out of the city and into a small, creaky cottage in the countryside. A 2-bedroom house with peeling white paint, ivy-wrapped porch columns, and hardwood floors that whispered under every step. It was peaceful. Lonely, yes, but peaceful. She told herself the solitude was a good thing. That Saturday morning had been unusually warm for early spring, the air already thick with the scent of wet soil and magnolia blossoms. Sophie had gone to the local flea market in town, hoping to find an old lamp or maybe a new chair for the reading nook by her front window. She hadn't expected the mirror. It was tucked in the back corner of a vendor's booth, half hidden behind a collapsed ironing board and some old tennis rackets. Nearly 6 feet tall, framed in black walnut, with subtle carvings that looked like vines or tendrils snaking along its edges, the mirror was undeniably beautiful, haunting even. The glass wasn't pristine. There were swirls in the silver backing, and in some angles, the reflection seemed slightly warped, like it had its own depth. Sophie stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before asking the vendor how much it was. The man shrugged. $40 and it's yours. Thing gives me the creeps, to be honest. She bought it on the spot. It barely fit in the back of her SUV. When she brought it home, she leaned it against the far wall in her bedroom, next to the window, so the morning light would hit it just right. And it did. By Sunday, the room looked warmer somehow, like the mirror had brought a new softness to the air. For the first 3 days, it was just a mirror. She caught herself glancing at it too often, maybe because she liked the way it made her bedroom feel more elegant, or maybe because it reminded her of something old and strange and perfect. But on the 4th night, she saw it. It was just after midnight. Sophie had gotten up to get water. She passed by the mirror on her way to the kitchen, and for a moment, her heart stopped. Her reflection didn't move. She froze in the doorway, staring at the glass. The version of herself inside the mirror stood perfectly still, head slightly tilted, eyes locked onto hers like a stranger sizing her up. And then, only then, did it slowly begin to move, as if realizing it had been caught off guard. Sophie stood there trembling. She blinked hard. Once, twice. Her reflection was normal again, following her movements perfectly. She laughed softly to herself. "You're tired," she whispered. "You've had too much wine. That's all." She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she decided not to look directly into the mirror. She brushed her teeth in the hallway bathroom instead, got dressed while facing the closet. It was silly, she knew, but she couldn't shake the cold, crawling sensation that had crept over her skin the night before. By lunch, she'd almost forgotten about it. That evening, while doing dishes, she got a text from her sister Rachel. "Hey, how's life in your haunted cottage?" "Fine," Sophie replied. "Not haunted. Peaceful. You sound like someone who definitely hasn't seen a ghost in her mirror." Sophie stared at the phone for a second. "Why would you say that?" she typed. Rachel answered immediately. "What? I was joking. I just meant you and your creepy antiques." Sophie didn't reply. That night, she covered the mirror with a blanket, just in case. Sophie woke just before dawn. The bedroom was still wrapped in blue-gray shadows, and for a moment she felt completely disoriented. The air was unnaturally still, as if the house had paused, waiting for her to realize something. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room. The mirror was uncovered. The beige blanket she'd thrown over it last night was folded neatly on the floor beside it, as though someone or something had carefully peeled it off and placed it there with intent. Her stomach dropped. She stared at her reflection. It looked normal, groggy, hair tousled, eyes bleary with sleep. But she didn't move. Neither did the image in the mirror. Sophie slowly sat up in bed, heart hammering against her ribs. She raised one hand. The reflection followed. She tilted her head, blinked. Normal again. She stood up, wrapped the blanket around the mirror once more, and left the room. She didn't return until evening that day. Sophie tried to keep busy. She went for a long walk through the nearby woods, stopped by the town cafe for tea, and even bought new candles from the local gift shop. Anything to distract herself from the sensation that something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed reading, she told herself it was just stress, a trick of the eyes, maybe a sleep disorder, maybe grief, old wounds from her divorce surfacing again in weird psychological ways. But part of her didn't believe that. Part of her knew she had brought something into her home the moment she bought the mirror. By midnight, she was still wide awake. Wind pushed against the window panes like searching fingers, and somewhere in the house, the floor creaked. Sophie rolled over, clutching the comforter tighter. Then came the whisper. It wasn't loud, barely more than breath against the air, but it was unmistakable. Sophie's. Her eyes shot open. The voice hadn't come from outside. It had come from the room, behind her, from the mirror. She turned slowly. The blanket was gone again. The mirror was bare, and her reflection was not in bed. Instead, it stood inside the glass, facing her, smiling faintly, not mimicking, not copying, watching, and then it moved. The reflection reached up with one pale hand and tapped against the inside of the mirror, right where her real face would have been if she'd stood there. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Her own face tilted, as if studying a painting. Then with a jerk, the smile widened, stretching too far. Sophie gasped and backed away. The reflection didn't follow. It simply stood, waiting, head cocked at a disturbing angle. Sophie scrambled from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She slept on the couch, lights on. Sophie didn't return to her bedroom for 3 days. She kept the door closed and slid the old oak bookshelf in front of it like a makeshift barricade, even though she knew how ridiculous that was. It was a mirror, not a portal, she told herself, not a door. But what unsettled her wasn't the object itself. It was what waited on the other side. On the second day, she made an appointment with her therapist, someone she hadn't spoken to since the divorce. They met over video. "I haven't been sleeping," Sophie said, keeping her voice low. "I've been seeing things in a mirror I brought home." Dr. Lyons gave a sympathetic nod. "Seeing things how?" "It's not a hallucination. It's my reflection. But it moves differently, separately. It watches me." She paused. "It smiled at me. It whispered my names." "Sophie," the therapist said gently, "have you considered that this might be a manifestation of isolation? You've gone through a major life change. You've moved to a rural area, and you're living alone. That combination can bring up all sorts of things." Sophie nodded. She didn't argue. But deep down, she knew this wasn't trauma. It wasn't grief. It wasn't her mind inventing shadows. This was real. On the third night, she heard the mirror again. The voice was louder this time. no longer a whisper, but a soft murmur, as if someone was speaking just behind the wall. It said her name again, repeatedly, patiently, lovingly. Sophie, Sophie, come here. I want to show you something. She sat on the couch, paralyzed, listening to the cadence of her own voice echoing from the bedroom. Then came the tapping. Slow, measured, tap, 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 followed by another voice layered beneath hers, darker, coarser. You don't belong there, Sophie. I do. She covered her ears. That night, she dreamed of standing on the other side of the glass. Everything was reversed. The bedroom was the same, but empty, hollow, cold. The light was dim and gray, like moonlight underwater. And her real self, the one with breath and warmth, was outside, pounding on the mirror, mouth open in a silent scream. Inside the dream, her reflection reached out, stroked the surface of the glass, and whispered, almost ready. When she woke up, her hands were pressed against the living room mirror. By the fourth day, Sophie had stopped pretending this was something she could rationalize. The mirror was not simply haunted, it was hungry. She drove into town early that morning, clutching her thermos like a lifeline. The local flea market was open again, and the vendor who'd sold her the mirror had a booth near the edge of the lot. She spotted his red truck from a distance. He was packing up boxes when she approached. Hey, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The mirror you sold me. Do you remember where you got it? The man scratched the back of his neck. You mean that tall walnut thing? Yeah, I remember. Where did it come from? He paused, clearly uncomfortable. House estate, out in Holman Ridge. Old lady passed. Her family didn't want anything, so we cleared it out. Did she die in front of it? Sophie asked, half joking, half praying for a rational story. The man's expression didn't change. Her body was found in the mirror, he said quietly. Not reflected, inside. That's what the cops said. Only her husband ever saw it. Swore up and down she was screaming behind the glass. Then, he killed himself 2 days later. Sophie stared at him, every hair on her arms standing upright. Why didn't you say anything before? He shrugged. Didn't think you'd actually buy it. Most people don't. She turned and walked away, hands trembling. On her way back to the car, a woman brushed past her, a short, older woman in a long green coat. Sophie barely noticed until the woman grabbed her arm. You brought it home, she said, voice like dry paper. You shouldn't have brought it home. Sophie froze. What? The mirror, the woman said. Her eyes were clouded, like stormy glass. It remembers every face that's ever looked too long, every soul that's ever paused and wondered. Don't let it look back too long. It's always waiting. Then she walked away, vanishing into the maze of booths. Sophie didn't drive home. She went to the church. She wasn't religious, hadn't been since college, but the old stone chapel near the edge of town felt safe in a way nothing else did. She sat in the back pew for over an hour, listening to her own breathing. Eventually, the priest approached. He didn't ask questions, just placed a hand on her shoulder and gave her a worn iron cross. Some things, he said, don't care if you believe in them, but they know if you're afraid. That night, Sophie returned home just before sunset. She didn't go upstairs. She dragged the mirror out the front door and down the porch steps. It scraped loudly against the floorboards, heavy and resisting. She hauled it into the backyard, dug a shallow pit near the trees, and laid it down. Then she poured lighter fluid over the frame. Her hand trembled as she lit the match. The moment the flame hit the wood, the mirror let out a screech, a high, splitting wail that rang in her ears and echoed into the trees like something alive. The glass twisted, cracked, flashed. She saw her reflection for the last time. It was smiling. The fire burned fast. Within minutes, flames had swallowed the antique walnut frame, curling wood into blackened ribs, flaking off varnish like dead skin. The glass, at first defiant, began to crack down the center, spiderwebbing outward in loud, sharp snaps. Sophie stood back, shielding her face, watching the thing scream itself into ruin. It wasn't the glass that made sound. It was something else, something deeper. The sound of rage, or pain, or protest. When the fire finally died, only a warped skeleton remained, molten edges, broken shards, and a thin fog of gray smoke hanging low to the earth, like a curse unspooled. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid anymore, but because her body refused to calm. Her muscles twitched, her ears rang. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her own reflection again, silent, smiling, waiting. The next morning, she carefully gathered the broken glass with gloves and buried it deeper in the woods, 100 feet past her property line. She scattered the pieces in different directions like ashes. Let the forest take it. When she came home, she showered with the lights on and threw out every other mirror in the house. Things were quiet for a while. A week passed, then 2. She began to feel normal again, like herself, like something horrible had passed through her and moved on. She went back to town, back to her walks, her coffee, her quiet solitude. The birds returned to the trees. Her house felt warm again, until the 11th night. She was brushing her teeth in the hallway bathroom, humming softly to herself, when she noticed it. Not at first, it was subtle. Barely there. The mirror in the medicine cabinet, one of the few she'd forgotten to throw out, flickered. Just once. She stared into it, toothbrush hanging loosely from her lips. Her reflection stared back. Same face, same pajamas, same everything. But then, it blinked. Only the reflection blinked. Her real eyes hadn't moved. Sophie stepped back. The light above the sink flickered, casting a second-long shadow across the mirror. And in that sliver of darkness, her reflection smiled, a long, slow grin that stretched beyond human comfort. The eyes narrowed, the head tilted, familiar now. "You burned the wrong side," it said. Sophie dropped the toothbrush. The light blew out. The mirror shattered. She backed into the hallway, heart galloping, trying to breathe. From upstairs, something moved. Footsteps, then another voice. Her voice, calling down softly, sweetly, "Sophie, it's not finished yet." Sophie didn't sleep again after that. She sat in the living room, a blanket around her shoulders, every light in the house on, listening to each creak, each sigh of wood and wind. The mirror had shattered, yes, but its presence hadn't left. Something else had gotten through. That was the truth. She now understood. It wasn't just the reflection wanting to mimic her, to be her. It had crossed over, somehow. Somewhere during the fire or the dream, or the first whisper. Whatever barrier had held it back was broken now. She thought about leaving, packing up and running. But where could she go? It wasn't the mirror anymore. It was her. It was inside her life now. She started seeing flickers of motion in windows, shadows that shouldn't be there. Her reflection would shift, subtly, even in places like stainless steel pots or glass tabletops, even when she wasn't looking directly at it. Once, while passing the TV, she caught her reflection standing still, staring, when she had been walking. Another time, she saw herself sitting at the kitchen table while she stood at the counter, and the dreams came harder now. Every night, deeper. In them, she was always underground, surrounded by hundreds of mirrors, old ones, cracked ones, clouded and broken, lining the walls like tombstones. And inside each one, Versions of her, all slightly wrong, all staring, all waiting. One of them always whispered, "You belong with us." She woke one night to find herself standing barefoot in the hallway, door to her bedroom wide open, the scent of burning walnut still clinging to the air. Something was in the room. She stepped closer, against every instinct in her body, and peered inside. The mirror was back, reassembled, the frame untouched, the glass smooth, impossible. She hadn't imagined burning it. The earth still held the blackened ashes, and yet here it was, perfect. Her reflection stood inside it already, calm, confident. Then, without Sophie moving, it stepped forward and smiled. "I'm ready now," it said. Then the glass rippled, like water, and the reflection began to press against it, not like a prisoner, but like someone unlocking a door they now had the key for. Sophie stumbled backward. The mirror shimmered like heat over pavement, pulsing faintly with that sickly underwater light. She tried to speak, tried to scream, but her throat seized. The only sound that escaped was a hoarse gasp, like something had punched the air from her lungs. Inside the glass, her reflection raised one hand and pressed it flat to the inside surface. Sophie's arm moved, not on its own, not quite, more like in response. A twitch, a mirrored instinct, dragged out of her body by something deeper than muscle. And then the reflection pushed. The glass bent outward. It didn't break. It yielded, like a curtain of heavy liquid. A fingertip slipped through. Not Sophie's. The skin was pale, almost translucent. The fingernail slightly too long. The hand moved with a grace that felt unnatural, like it had never forgotten the shape of Sophie's body, but had only ever studied it. Sophie forced herself to move, backing away step by step. "No," she whispered. "You're not real. You're not." "But I am," said the reflection. Its voice was smoother now, bolder, confident in its permanence. "I'm everything you looked away from, every time you stared into the glass and wondered who you really were." Sophie ran, down the stairs, into the cold night air. Her bare feet hit gravel, wet grass. She didn't look back, not until she was halfway to the road. She turned, heart thundering, and froze. There, in the upstairs window, stood a figure. Her figure, watching. It raised a hand and waved, then disappeared into the shadows. She checked into a motel on the edge of town. Didn't bring anything with her, but her phone and car keys. Slept with the bathroom light on, and all the mirrors covered with towels. The clerk at the front desk gave her a strange look when she asked for duct tape and a hammer, but didn't ask questions. The next morning she drove back to the house, carefully. She expected it to be quiet, deserted. It wasn't. There were lights on inside. The front door was unlocked, and the coffee pot was half full. On the kitchen table sat a list, her handwriting, but not her words. Groceries, eggs, milk, candles, matches. Don't forget to check the basement mirror. Sophie stared at it. She had never written that. She had never had a mirror in the basement. Sophie stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase swallowed by shadow. The air that rose up from below was cool and damp, tinged with mildew and the faintest hint of something metallic, like blood and wet stone. She had never used the basement, never had a reason. It was just a storage space, the previous owners had said. But now something waited there. She flicked the switch. Nothing. Of course. She turned on her phone's flashlight and descended. Each step groaned under her weight, as though the house disapproved. As she reached the bottom, her light swept across boxes, old furniture, and forgotten things wrapped in dusty sheets. And then it landed on it. A mirror, tall, oval, standing in the farthest corner. She didn't remember it being there, had never seen it. But there it was, unmistakable, elegant, timeless. Her heart thundered as she stepped closer. Oh, it wasn't broken. In fact, it was cleaner than anything else in the basement. The glass glowed faintly in the dimness, as if it had its own source of light. Her reflection was already waiting. This one didn't smile, didn't wave. It looked at her like a predator studying the moment before a kill. The pupils were too wide, the lips too red, and something about the face. It looked exactly like Sophie, yes, but sharper, like someone had sculpted her from memory and sharpened the edges. And then it spoke, not aloud, inside her head. "I'm not trying to get out anymore," it said. Sophie felt a chill rise in her spine. "I already did." She turned and ran, up the stairs, into the kitchen, into the daylight. But as she reached the front door, she saw it, in the hallway mirror, herself, smiling, wearing different clothes, holding the iron cross she had left at the church. The reflection spoke, this time aloud. "You're the one inside now, Sophie." The door slammed shut behind her. The world became warped, like she was underwater, or inside a dream where all the rules had changed. The air felt too dense, every sound muffled, slowed. Sophie stumbled backward into the hallway, but her reflection stayed in place. It didn't follow, because it didn't have to. It had already taken her place. The real Sophie, or what was left of her, stood now inside. She didn't know how it had happened, when the exchange had completed. If it was the burning, the dream, the basement, or all of it, weaving slowly into a noose around her soul. She turned to run, but her body didn't respond. Not the way it used to. The hallway stretched. The walls pulsed with veins of shadow. Pictures on the walls twisted into distorted images, reflections of her, always her, but wrong in small, hideous ways. Grinning too wide, bleeding from the eyes, wearing a wedding dress she never owned. From every surface, she saw versions of herself, watching from within. Then came the sound. A knock, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. She followed it like a moth to flame, drifting into the living room. There, inside the darkened window pane, her reflection leaned in close from the other side of the glass. Not in the world, not quite in the mirror, somewhere between. "I like it here," the thing whispered. "I like your life." Sophie tried to speak, but no sound came out. She looked down at her own hands, paler now, slightly transparent. Her skin shimmered faintly, like silver foil. She wasn't real anymore, not fully, and the realization hit her like a blow. She had been replaced. No one would know. The thing in the world wore her voice, her clothes, her thoughts. It was her now, just a little brighter, a little more charming, a little more healed. It would go to brunch with Rachel. It would joke with the barista in town. It would smile kindly at the flea market vendor and thank him for the mirror. It would live her life better than she had, and no one would ever question it. Time didn't pass the same way in the mirror. There was no sun, no wind, no sound, only an eternal dusk, where everything looked familiar but lacked substance. The house existed here, yes, but hollow, like a museum built from memory. Sophie wandered the halls, barefoot, unblinking. Her reflection, the other her, no longer appeared. There was no glass to peer into from this side, no surfaces to knock on, no cases coming back, only silence. She screamed once, just to see if she still could. The sound felt thin, lost in the air like breath in winter. No echo, no bounce. She tried opening doors. Some led to copies of her bedroom, her kitchen, her porch. Others led to places she didn't recognize. Rooms too large, hallways too narrow, staircases that looped back into themselves. a version of her house that had never existed. She saw mirrors now and then, but they didn't reflect her. Just darkness, just void. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, but she didn't die either. And somewhere in that colorless purgatory, she realized this was not punishment, it was containment. The thing that had taken her place was not just a reflection, it was a parasite, a collector, a devourer of identity. It didn't want to destroy her, it wanted to be her, and it had succeeded. But she wasn't the first. She saw them sometimes, in corners down long halls. Shapes, flickers, women like her, eyes wide, mouths open, some angry, some number, all trapped, all reflections that had dared to look too long. Sophie sat on the floor of what used to be her bedroom and stared at a blank wall for what might have been days, then weeks. She had no way to measure, and then something changed. A light, soft flickering. It came from a mirror that hadn't been there before. Tall, oval, silver framed. The glass shimmered, and in it, a young woman peered back. Early 20s, nervous, brows furrowed. Sophie stood slowly. The girl turned her head slightly, glancing at the antique mirror's edges. "I like this one," the girl whispered aloud. To no one. A vendor off-screen responded, muffled. Sophie stepped closer to the glass. The girl's face was familiar. A stranger, yes, but familiar in the way all people are. Before they become memories, their eyes met, and the girl hesitated just for a moment. Then Sophie did the only thing she could. She raised her hand and smiled.